The poor apostles seem to face setback after setback. We see how early in the Easter season, how the disciples were scared, locked up in the upper room after the resurrection of Jesus. And yet he comes in and breaks in into their midst and offers them peace. We heard about how Peter was crippled by his past and of denying Christ, and yet how Jesus chooses him to be one of the great leaders of the early church. Then we heard last week about how this minority in the early church is being ignored, and that seeming setback gives way to the new ministry of deacons. In Philip, we see a great image of a God who is not hindered by setbacks, a Holy Spirit who continues to move in us despite what seem like setbacks in our lives. So let's dig into this figure of Stephen, what we hear about him in our first reading today and don't hear about him in our first reading today, and what his example of faith and witness of faith can teach us today. Okay, so in this passage from Acts of the Apostles, we hear about how Philip goes to Samaria. Now, I'll give you a little backstory. Remember last week we talked about Stephen and how as Stephen continues to proclaim the good news to the people in Jerusalem, there's mounting tension and how it leads to the persecution and the martyrdom of Stephen. So in the series of Luke and Acts, this event is huge. It's pivotal. We have been working all through the book of Luke to get to Jerusalem. The resurrection appearances happened in Jerusalem. The apostles begin to preach the good news in Jerusalem. And after this persecution of the Christians and the martyrdom of Stephen, things shift. We go from Jerusalem out into the rest of the world. So this martyrdom of Stephen is a huge turning point. And so we're just on the cusp of that event in our first reading today. This great setback of the martyrdom of Stephen propels the apostles out to other parts of the world. So we hear about Philip, who goes to the place of Samaria. Now Samaria, as you know, are the great adversaries of Jerusalem, of the Jewish people. We think, for example, about the Samaritan woman at the well, or the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus uses, in which he shows that God's kingdom is for all, even those who are seemingly outside of God's mercy. Now, the Samaritans are a group of people who used to be part of the 12 tribes of Israel, but they were conquered by the Assyrians, they intermarried, and so if you asked a Jewish person in Jesus' time what they thought of Samaritans, they might likely have told you that they saw them as half-breed heretics. They don't really have anything to do with them, nothing in common with them. And yet to these most unlikely people, St. Philip goes. Imagine this. He has just seen his buddy and fellow deacon, Stephen, martyred. And now he goes to the epicenter of Samaria to preach the good news, knowing full well what could happen to him. And so he goes out to proclaim the good news in Samaria, and something amazing happens. They listen. They receive it. God does amazing things through Philip as he goes there on a whim, on his own, just impelled by the Holy Spirit. And this gets the attention of the leaders in Jerusalem. So we hear about how Peter and John go down from Jerusalem to Samaria to check this out. Now, his preaching is so impressive that he is won over by someone else is won over to the kingdom that we don't hear about in our reading today. But if you notice, our first reading has the beginning and the end, and it cuts out the middle. This story of a guy by the name of Simon, not to be confused with Simon Peter. We hear about stay with me, as Philip proclaims the good news, he also gets the attention of this magician by the name of Simon. Simon, who is a dark magician, or an occult, kind of like a sorcerer, who uses dark magic. And Simon also wins over the crowds, but he does it through the power of deceit and through dark magic. Now, he hears about Philip, who is doing these amazing things, who is winning over the crowds. And this Simon comes to believe in the God that Philip is proclaiming. It's a reminder and a show to compare and contrast how the Holy Spirit does not work in our lives through deceit or by winning us over or through cunning, but through opening us up to something new, to something different. That God's power is not magic. God doesn't deceive us, but God opens us up to a new freedom and a new truth. So, anyways, the preaching of the good news so gets the attention of the apostles that they come down to Samaria, and because they hear about people who have been baptized but haven't yet received the Holy Spirit. Now, that's curious because this is going to be a reading that we will hear and is one of the options for the sacrament of confirmation. Just as in confirmation, people have a laying on of hands and receive the Holy Spirit, and that action, we say it in the church, completes or is the fullness of the Spirit they have received in baptism. So we see the foreshadowings of that here in this passage. So let's recap. The persecution in Jerusalem and the martyrdom of Stephen led Philip out to Samaria. Samaria comes to believe and to convert. A dark magician comes to believe and gives witness to this power of Christ. This experience gives birth and a foreshadowing to the sacrament of confirmation. Look at how the Spirit has kind of done all of this. In the words of St. Teresa of Avila, has God right straight with crooked lines. How all of this, God is not impeded. The Holy Spirit can still be at work. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, I think that we can see in Philip a man who doesn't let seeming setbacks set him back. That he knows that the Spirit is the one who is ultimately at work. The Spirit is doing all of this. Now, we aren't living during a time of persecution in which people are dying for the faith. But we are very much living in a time where people of faith are dying in this time of pandemic. And in order to honor them, we should live differently. And we should adapt and have adapted to wearing masks, to being socially distant, out of love for them and out of love for our fellow brothers and sisters, that this illness can stop. And yet, this time that seems like a setback is also giving birth to all sorts of new possibilities. We are connecting in ways that we never would have had before had we not had to. We are in this time experiencing a tremendous spiritual hunger for the Eucharist, which I know I feel it too for you. But may that awaken in us a greater respect and honor for the Eucharist when we are able to come back to it. And maybe we have shifted to connecting in new ways. And this time has opened up a door for us to reconnect with the family member that we haven't talked to in a long time. Or to reconnect with members of our family that pre-corona we would never talk about these issues. But now we have the time and the space to do it. Can't we see in Philip an example of Christ, a reflection of Jesus? Jesus who is never held back, who continues preaching no matter the opposition, who challenges religious leaders, who transform the greatest setback of death into a resurrection and a revolution for us. A totally different way of thinking, a totally different way of living. So as we head into these final 2 weeks of the Easter season, and 2 weeks away from now celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, or the coming of the Holy Spirit, how are you being invited to trust, like Philip did, that in the Holy Spirit, who is never set back?